Prova, sì. Prova, podio, sì.
Prova, sì.
Prova. Prova, sì. Prova, sì.
of the University of Pisa, it's my pleasure to introduce you Francesco Marcelloni, who is the Vice Rector for the International Cooperation and Relations. So please, Francesco.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Also for inviting me just for this introduction. And obviously I also bring the greetings from our rector, Professor Maccarella. He wasn't be here for previous meetings, but I will tell me just to give you the greetings and also the welcome here in Pisa. Okay, thank you very much for all participants to be present here, and welcome to the international distinguished speakers coming from many European and international institutions, University, National Statistical Institute, Eurostat, World Bank. I'm very, very pleased to be here today and just to address the discussion of the final event of Gen Monnet Chair Small Area Methods and Living Condition Indicators in European Poverty Studies. I would like to thank very much the organizer, the Erasmus Plus Gen Monnet Action, the Inter-University Task Center Camillo Dagum, the MASPOL project coordinated by ISTAT and the International Relations Office of the Department of Economics and Management, and the chairholder, Professor Monica Pratesi of the University of Pisa. Thank you very much also for this wonderful organization. The workshop is the final event of the Monnet Chair project, and the project was aimed at introducing students and stakeholders to the study of local statistics on poverty and living conditions in order to provide reliable evidence to monitor European Union regional policy. The theme is really relevant as the monitoring of sustainable development goal is a major issue of the Agenda 2030 of the United States nations. The chair deepened the themes treated in the curriculum of official statistics on the Master of Science and Economics of the University of Pisa. This insight is unique novel in the curricula at the graduate level in Pisa and, as far as I know, in Italy and in Europe. And this also is really very, very interesting for us and from an international perspective. The workshop is organized in keynote speeches and tables of discussion and hosts the reflection section of the Maxwell project on the next research themes of the Framework Program 9 of the European Commission. It aims to explore our current scientific advances on studying and monitoring of poverty and living conditions in various dimensions are linked in order to support EU regional policies. This last point is relevant and motivates the panel discussion with statisticians and policymakers on how policymaking can be enhanced by the knowledge of local poverty measures, which are discussed in the workshop. Also, the student of the chair will participate to the workshop, presenting in the poster section some results of their activity. The chair, headed by Professor Monica Pratesi of the University of Pisa, in the academic years for 2015 to 2018, offered 2 courses on European poverty indicators, a small area estimation, to the students of the University of Pisa and to the Erasmus incoming students. And I have just highlighted that we have a large amount of incoming students in the Erasmus framework, approximately 500 in the University of Pisa, and I have also told that a good part of these students really are involved in economy. The topics of the courses were deepened by lectures given by distinguished professors coming from many European universities. Professor Risto Leitonen of the University of Helsinki, Professor Ralph Munich of the University of Trier, Professor Natalie Shlomo of the University of Manchester, Professor Francesca Gagliardi of the University of Siena, Professor Luigi Bigeri, Emeritus Professor of the University of Florence, and many seminars focused on the poverty measure given by distinguished international experts as Professor Partalairi of the University of Maryland, and many researchers from the Italian National Statistics Institute, ISTAT. I hope that the pronunciation of the names was correct. The arrow here should have animate the discussion of the topics of the chair, statistical method to produce effective data on poverty and living conditions at the local level in Europe in the era of data deluge and big data. The aim of the chair was threefold: enhancing the students' and stakeholders' abilities to understand and analyze the 6% of poverty and living condition indicators in Europe, multidimensional latent poverty indicators, unemployment rates, subjective well-being indicators. The second was building up and teaching a statistical toolbox of small area methods based on traditional new techniques of survey data collection and the integration in order to produce local values and estimates of the indicator for the monitoring of the effects of the local and regional policy in the area of big data and data deluge. Educating the students to communicate the result of small area methods to the stakeholders, to feed the evidence-based process of policymaking with flash estimates, and to provide guidance on what might be the products that arise in the reliability of the estimates and the quantitative evaluation of regional policy. The last point is relevant and motivate the poster section, where the students of this year will present their final work and the panel discussion with official statisticians and policymakers on how policymaking can be enhanced by the knowledge of local poverty measures which are discussed in the workshop. Concluding, I would like to thank very much all the speakers and participants to the conference. I wish you good work and a pleasant stay in Pisa. And we are very, very proud just to host this workshop. And as the University of Pisa, I hope that just this is an event that confirms our international dimensions as a university, and I hope just a starting point for other events in the same project. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Francesco, for having built this framework for the workshop. And as the chair was hosted by the Master of Science in Economics, jointly organized by the Dipartimento di Economia e Management and by the Sant'Anna School, I would like to have some words from the director of the Master of Science in Economics, that is, who is here, and is Davide Piazzi.
A great success. Oh, sorry, thank you. Great success for the Master of Science and Economics, and I think that this is a typical example of good funding, good use of funds. Okay, for Europe, and I think that this was also an example that. In some respect, we get a lot of feedback at international level, for example, for our relationship with international institutions, thanks to Monica, and also for our relationship with other institutions, again, thanks to this chair. And I think that this is just a first step. I'm just looking forward for the next success in the application. And so, good luck, Monica. I thank you for your work, great work at the Master of Science in Economics. Thank you.
Many thanks, Davide. Even too much. Because as you perfectly know, these events and these things, like the church, can be organized only in a staff. And our cooperation has been very, very great and very fruitful. And this is why I would like also an address from the coordinator of the international activity of the Dipartimento di Economia e Management, who is Giulio Greco.
Thank you, Monica. First of all, let me thank you, Professor Pratesi, the scientific committee, and the organizing committee. And thanks also to you all for coming here to Pisa for this wonderful workshop. This wonderful workshop is one of the, among many others organized by our department. Our department is especially in the last 10 years, strongly committed to international research activities and teaching activities. We engaged a lot through our international relation offices and all the staff at the department in Jean Monnet Erasmus Plus projects. And the effort and the commitment were awarded by funding like this project. I can remember that this Jean Monnet Chair was activated in 2015 and will hopefully be renewed. And this is the perfect witness of really the commitment and the effort that our department is spending in these activities. And I would like to thank Professor Pratesi again for this important cultural and scientific value creation. The Jean Monnet Chair is, of course, a very, very important project, as this workshop shows. We have more than 70 participants coming from a number of countries in the world, in this wonderful Le Benedettine complex, for which we also have the contribution of the University of Pisa. And I would like to let's say, just enjoy your workshop, enjoy your activities, enjoy your stay in Pisa. Thank you.
So, Letizia Ravagli is representing IRPET here, and I am expecting some words from this IRPET, because I think that these themes are important for the economic and development growth of Tuscany. So, please.
Yes. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I work for IRPET, that if you don't know it, is the Regional Institute for the Economic Planning of Tuscany. We work for the region of Tuscany. We make studies about the economic situation of our region, and we evaluate the impact of policies on growth and on the income distribution. After the economic crisis that started in 2008, the interest of the region and our institute too on the themes of poverty and on income distribution increased. So it is important for our institute to learn new methodologies about small area estimates. We are interested in going into details and analyze the effects of the crisis among households and territories in our region. So I really appreciate to participate to this conference today, and so thanks.
Okay, many thanks. So, I would like to close this welcome and opening, just giving you some numbers. The chair involved about 60 students, 60 Master of Science students for each academic year, and in total we worked for 3 academic years, so you can do you can size the work that we have done. And they were incoming Erasmus students and also students enrolled in the Master of Science in Economics, mainly in the official statistics curriculum. They attended a total of seven teaching activities, as the Vice Rector have just said, and several seminars. But we had the first graduate student of the program yesterday, because he discussed the dissertation yesterday and obtained the maximum level with honor. So I invite you to the presentation of his contribution tomorrow. But this is not the only result that we have already done and obtained together, because the teaching materials of the 2 main courses have been collected and will be published by the Pisa University Press, I think at the end of this year. The book is co-authored by 3 students and is divided into parts. A first part that is a collection of the teaching materials, and that is a standard part, but there is a second part where we are collecting all the research themes developed during the chair and deepened with the help of the distinguished teacher cooperating in the chair. And these are going to be also the, I would say, the topics of the final dissertations of these three students. They are here now. They are Lisa and Francesca, and we miss, I think, only one, Alessandro, who is working and studying outside, but is coming back in Pisa during May. So our best result, I think, is what we have done for the future generations, because one of the objective, I would say the main objective of the chair, is to contribute to the continuous development of statistical culture and knowledge that fits into the assessment framework for monitoring poverty in Europe, and consequently develop the respective training curricula of European studies on poverty and living conditions. So this is relevant from my point of view, also because we need to reflect on the future research needs in terms of statistical methodologies and new data, and this to contribute to define the future pathways for the new European Framework Program. And this is something that we are going together with the ISTAS and with you in the final day of this workshop. So that's all for now. Many thanks for being here. And I think that it's time for the first keynote speech by, let me pronounce it properly, Joao Pedro Azevedo, okay, that's fine, that is going to have the keynote, the first keynote of the workshop. So many thanks. May I introduce you? Yeah. Okay. That's a workshop. That means that is not a conference. That means that every keynote is the opening speech on which we have to reflect and to deepen in the other sessions and tables of the workshop itself. So let me introduce Joao. Joao Pedro Azevedo is the lead economist from the Poverty and Equity Practice at the World Bank, based in Washington, D.C. In the past 10 years, Joao Pedro has worked in a range of low-income, middle-income, and high-income countries on topics related to welfare measurement and policy design, implementation, and monitoring. More recently, Joao Pedro was led the second phase of a partnership with DG Regio to support the production poverty maps using small area estimation across new European member states. Before joining the bank, Joao Pedro served as the Superintendent of Monitoring and Evaluation at the Secretary of Finance for the state of Rio de Janeiro, okay, as well as a research fellow at the Institute of Applied Economic Research from the Brazilian Ministry of Planning. He is a former chairman of the Latin American and Caribbean Network on Inequality and Poverty and holds a PhD in economics. So please, Joao Pedro, the floor is yours, and I go over there to listen to you. Thanks.
Okay, I think this is working. So basically our session today is about monetary and multidimensional poverty, and the idea of this talk is to share with you some of our lessons learned in the process of this partnership with DG Regio to produce circa around 9 small area estimation poverty maps for the EU member states. And how has that been useful for not just a measurement point of view, but for policy dialogue. Let me just turn on the timer here. So I think small area estimation is more important than ever, and some of the reasons are the proximity to the 2020 round of the next population census, which I think it will be the first one that will really kind of allow us to break ground when it comes to the merge of the new sources of data, so-called big data, with traditional statistical methods. Right? There's a lot of possibilities and opportunities that we've now been playing with, but that will only be truly possibly validated after the 2020 round of the population census. And for that, I think it's critical to engage in this area and maybe more than ever be strategic about it, because questionnaires for the 2020 round of the census are being finalized as we speak, and the window that we have to make any kind of suggestions are closing. I think more geospatial and geocoded data is being available, and I think that it opens up a lot of possibilities in this front. The demand for spatial information is also on the rise, as we can see from most governments, given that fiscal constraints are not going away. In spite of our, concerns that we might have or dislikes of austerity, the reality is that governments are operating in very, very tight constraints, and for that they need to allocate resources in the most efficient manner. And spatial allocation of resources and the assessment of how resources have been used from a spatial point of view are, I think, a very tangible or easily understandable approach for policymakers. Now, so most of what I'll be sharing with you today draw from this collaboration of the World Bank with DG Regio and statistical agencies across 9 EU member states, in which basically in the course of 2.5 years, we basically have joined forces to produce poverty maps using small area estimation methods across this set of countries. Now, the idea was very much to use this to help the 2020 budget cycle of the EU, and I think we'll reflect a little bit on some of the lessons learned from that process as well. I don't think we need to go over the process of small area estimation for this audience, and I think the idea today is really to go more on the policy and the motivation. So I think that, but we can go back to the method. I mean, most of our approaches were either using the ELL or Fay-Harriott type of modeling, given data constraints. Now, I think what is important to acknowledge is that in the space of the official statistical system of Europe, small area estimation is now recognized as an official source of statistics, very much in the space of experimental statistics. And this is something that, for me, I think it's groundbreaking in the context of the EU, which, to my surprise, much of my surprise, I was expecting the EU to be significantly, especially the statistical agencies and Eurostat, to be significantly more advanced on the use of small area estimation. Maybe because I was coming with an expectation of the US Census Bureau or Statistics Canada, which really have embraced those methods, right? My sense is that Eurostat and many statistical agencies across EU member states have not yet, are only now starting to use or to consider small area estimation as part of their toolkit of official statistics. I think this is an important aspect of this work, because it gives us a much stronger endorsement to those methods. But at least in my experience in dialogue across new member states, there's always still within the official statistics community a certain sense of reluctance or distrust, which surprises me, because this is not a new field, right? But maybe I'm preaching to the choir. Now, of course, understanding the spatial distribution of poverty is extremely important, and I think there's much to be learned in the context of the EU on that regard. So this is basically the combination of the work that we've done with the work that a Norwegian consortium led by have done on small area estimation across the old member states, if you will. And when we stitch them together, this is the picture that we get. Now, it's important to keep in mind that all these poverty maps were done using the official Eurostat definition, AROP, which is 60% of the median income on each country. Now, one thing that I will talk a little bit about it is how maybe it's a reflection on how should we present this work for policymakers. Because in the bank a while ago, we had a book that came out that, arguing that poverty maps were more than a pretty picture. I think my little poke on that is that often it's no more than a busy picture. Because you look at some of the poverty maps that we produce, it's very hard to distill the policy messages from it. And I think there's much to be done, I think, on how we can actually make it easier for policymakers to consume the information that comes from poverty maps. And I think that local indicators of spatial agglomeration, such as hotspots or Gettysburg, I think have a long way to go on that, especially when properly done. Now, of course, there is a lot to be learned about these maps. I think one thing that it was very, and again, for this audience, it might seem very obvious, but when we engage with both policymakers at the country level and even colleagues at DG Regio, there was always this surprise when people realized that the poorest parts of countries are not necessarily where most of the poor live, right? This notion of the difference between the poverty rate and the poverty density, right? Which I think that, I'm sure for you comes as a very natural concept. It is striking to how policymakers still associate territorial poverty with the density of poverty. And many of them are surprised that their capital often is the place where most of the poor in their country lives, right? Now, of course, as you also are probably familiar, I think one very striking motivation for this kind of work is the Simpsons paradox, right? That the level of spatial aggregation matters, and matters a lot for policy analysis, right? I don't think I probably might not need to spend a lot of time on this with this audience, but the reality is that we can find very different correlations on a particular phenomena by just changing the level of aggregation, right? And this is an illustration, but basically by looking at two subgroups, we see a positive correlation. When you aggregate them, you find a negative correlation, right? And the reality is that this is not an abstraction, right? Using EU data and the poverty maps that we've produced, I can share with you this exercise in which basically we looked at basically the progressivity, if you will, how progressive is spending in terms of the cohesion funds and the common agricultural policy funds. For those from Europe or not from Europe, the common agricultural policy is basically about 40 billion euros a year of subsidies that go as the largest program devoted or implemented by the EU, and the cohesion funds is the territorial funds to help regional integration. And when we look at the progressivity of these two sources of funds at the NUTS 3 level, which was only made possible through this effort, we find that in orange we have the cohesion funds, in blue we have the CAP funds. They're more or less the same. Maybe the cohesion funds are slightly more progressive, if you will, right? But using the same budget, the same resource, the same administrative records, by simply changing the level of spatial aggregation to the LAU2, the municipality, right? We produce the figure on the right, which shows how significantly more progressive the common agricultural resources are when compared to the cohesion funds, suggesting that the cohesion funds do not go to the poorest parts of each one of the regions that it serves. And we can also shape our understanding of some very basic things, such as the relationship between agriculture and poverty, right? So if we were to use basically the SILC data, the Survey of Income and Living Conditions, we would have the upper panel of this figure, which shows the relationship between agriculture, land use, share of land use devoted to agriculture at each one of those nuts as reported by the SILC, right? And the two messages there is that, first of all, for half of the EU member states, we wouldn't be able to look at this relationship because basically there's no data at the subnational level from the SILC, right? The second is that basically this relationship could be somewhat misleading when we compare to the bottom panel of this figure, which is replicating the same exercise, but now using the NUTS-3 data produced using small area estimation. Now, all the bars here are statistically significant, and because we are using small area estimation, all these exercises are done through simulation. So we basically run these regressions using some kind of MI type of approach. Basically, we pull it regressions 100 times using the different vectors of the SAE in order to do the inference of this as well as we could. And what is interesting is that you can see that there are some countries in which the coefficients change completely, like Belgium, in which at the nuts we find a positive relationship, which I think you can see here, right? And when we look at the NUTS-3, basically they show a negative relationship between poverty and agriculture, which basically suggests that these are countries in which land use or agriculture, land use devoted to agriculture has been delinked from poverty, right? And there are a handful of EU member states in which basically poverty or land devoted to agriculture in a particular region is no longer a synonym of high poverty at that locality, right? Which is part of the process of structural transformation of these countries, in which basically these are countries that have high productivity agricultural product that they are producing and exporting goods at high value and value, which basically allows the poverty rate of those localities to be low. Now, of course, much of this work, I think, requires validation in order to be basically consider official statistics, and this is something that we've learned throughout this process, right? Especially when we engage with ministries of regional development, and even and as I said earlier, even across statistical agencies, right? There's still, to much to my surprise, a lot of reluctancy within officials from many statistical agencies in the EU against this kind of methods. And so part of what we had to do was to basically validate as much as we could this kind of work. And one thing that to me I think it was extremely valuable as a lesson from the EU is the potential that your member states have to link different sources of data. So late in this process, we found out that in many EU member states, it is possible to link the respondents from the survey with their responses in the census. And in some cases, even with the responses on tax records and on administrative records, which basically, I think it's a complete game changer when it comes to small area estimation, because we no longer need to make assumptions regarding the covariates that we are using for the SAE, basically, right? We can actually pull and use the same covariates from the census of origin. And this is an example from Bulgaria in which basically we look at we had some difficulties aligning the observable characteristics of households in Bulgaria as they responded the survey and the population census. And basically it boils down to issues of household size. Basically in the census, the household sizes, and this is one example here, right? It had a very different distribution than in the SILC, right? And that was largely because of university students, which in the census were reported as single member households, and in the survey were actually considered in their households of origin. Now, single-member households are often in a very precarious situation because they have no economies of scale, they have no way of sharing resources, and because of that, they tend to be they're more likely to be in poverty. And that basically biased our estimates significantly in the context of Bulgaria. Now, we were able to solve this by being able to link and basically the responses from the census with the data from the survey, and through that basically solve the problem. So here you have, let's say, the empirical distribution of the observable characteristics, if you will, of both the silk and the census, and you can see that these two distributions do not overlap. Once we actually use the data from the census itself, what we do find is this dotted line here, in which we match, in which basically we do a much better job on the covariance, right, of the silk with this combined with the census, and that in itself made a lot of difference on our final estimates. Now, this is an interesting compromise because not all EU member states are in the status of Denmark and Germany that can have de jure continuous census, right? But many of the member states can actually link these two data sources, right? And with that, you can make, I think, a lot of progress on the field of smart estimation. Now, of course, validation is critical, and for all of these exercises, we've always reported that, always at the level of certification of the survey, and we have that for Bulgaria, and this is just the Bulgarian and Latvia example. Another thing that we've done also was to explore the possibilities of breakdowns by demographic subgroups. This is something that policymakers are often interested. They want us to go beyond the headline number. So especially for policy, it's not useful often to just talk about total poverty. They want to know the poverty of children, the poverty among the elderly. Now, of course, as you break it down, the confidence intervals increase, and we report that as required. But we do it in a very transparent way. Now, this is, I'll come back to this point a little bit later in my talk. Now, another way in which basically we were able to make use of this kind of information, especially when, for those ministries that are interested in territorial development, was by using the poverty maps, estimated using SAE, and linking it with other sources of administrative data to create territorial or indexes of regional development. Right, in the context of the EU, there is significant interest on the agenda of territorial development. Traditionally, most of the measures of territorial development that we looked at in the context of the EU use some form of principal component analysis. We are not particularly super fond of principal component analysis, simply because at the end, the interpretability, it's very convoluted, right? So what we've done in the context of Croatia was very much to produce a measure in the spirit of an MPI, right, a multidimensional poverty index, but a spatial MPI, in which basically the unit of analysis is the municipality, and we look at the joint distribution of 30-odd different sources of data using, which are decided as part of a consultative process. I mean, I'm not going to claim that this matrix here this is a political process, right? Let's make no mistake. Any regional development measure is the reflection of a political process, and it has to be, because this has to be owned by policymakers in the country. So we had a process with them to basically agree on the domains and the topics of analysis, and then, of course, on the basis of that, identified indicators that could be used and that were updated at a sufficient frequency. Most of this come from administrative records, which at the municipal level, which can be updated every year. And with that information, and one of the inputs that we used to select those indicators was the poverty map, right? Many times what people do for this kind of exercise is correlate with GDP, right? Because we were, now of course that might give you a very different subset of indicators to be selected, right? In the context of this exercise, what we've done was to use the poverty map to help us guide basically how each one of those indicators would be incorporated in our multidimensional measure, and with which sign and which effect. And basically, we can find out that those things are highly complementary. And here what you have is the distribution of all municipalities of Croatia. There are about 500 of them. In the vertical axis, we have the monetary measure of poverty. In the horizontal axis, we have this index of multiple deprivation, right? And what we find is we would, anticipate in any kind of MPI measure is that we can find municipalities with the same level of multiple deprivation that have very different levels of monetary poverty, and municipalities with the same, oops, sorry. My wife. I trust everything's okay. So I will answer if she calls again. Sorry, we have an agreement, especially when I go on mission. Sorry, but and we can find several municipalities with the same level of monetary poverty, with very different levels of multiple deprivation. And this is the policy hook, right? Because what you want is basically use that in order to understand what kind of shortcomings and constraints are present in each one of these places. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot to be done still on how to improve the presentation of this kind of work. And as I said, I think that often it's not more than a busy picture. All these kind of spaghetti colors with lots of different, which is very hard for the policymaker to identify, what should I put my marginal dollar, or how can I use this information. One thing that we've been using more and more is this literature on local indicators of spatial association. Now, of course, when you're doing that, you have, given that these poverty maps are the result of simulation, you have to actually do this, iteratively multiple times in order to respect the properties of our measure, right? Since this literature, traditionally it's done on administrative records. But here, the advantage is that this is a test statistic in itself, and it shows very clearly to policymakers areas which have above median or above mean poverty, areas that have low poverty. And that is a lot easier. 3 categories seems to be a lot easier for policymakers to absorb than 556 values for different municipalities, which everybody, the moment you show, the mayor of each one of those municipalities starts to argue why my municipality is less poor than the neighboring municipality that he knows so well. And it becomes a distraction from a policy dialogue point of view. And we feel that basically by grouping and in a more kind of clear-cutting ways, we can move beyond the noise and engage on what is significantly more substantive issues, which is, where should the focus and the priority be. Now, I think it's also important to manage expectations regarding how often all of this changes, right? Especially now in the time of big data, and there's a huge level of anxiety among policymakers, and there's a very strong feeling that everything changes by the minute, and if I don't get the poverty map of yesterday, I'm looking at economic history. And this is an example of Brazil, a country which in the last 20 years has observed massive poverty reduction, and who has comparable poverty maps. And believe me, you probably know this better than I. There are very few countries with comparable poverty maps over time, and methodologically comparable poverty maps over time. Brazil, the US, and Mexico are the 3 that I was able to find. And what we, to our surprise, or maybe not, what we found is that when you focus on the patterns of spatial agglomeration of poverty, those results seem to be a lot more persistent over time, right? Over a period of 20 years, basically, the high poverty parts of Brazil have remained virtually the same. Now you might ask what happened to the Amazon here, and I'll tell you, well, the survey only started to collect data on the rural part of the Amazon in 2006. So in reality, in 2000 and 1991, we just didn't have that data. And if I had chosen the 9 metropolitan areas with the highest number of poor people in 1991, I wouldn't have gotten a single one of them wrong 20 years later, right? Which, you know, it's not surprising because people are not moving, you know, at crazy rhythms. But it's also very telling for policymakers because my sense is that the shelf life of this kind of work is much longer than policymakers often tend to believe, right? And we have replicated similar exercises using the American Community Survey, this time not with small estimation for the US and Mexico, and the results are similar. I think that another important area for use of this kind of approaches is to discuss inequality. Right, I think that a poverty map is probably one of the most mislabeled things in statistics because essentially it's not about poverty, it's about inequality. Right, if there was no inequality, you know, there would be no differences in territorial and spatial pattern of poverty across space. And in Latvia, we were able to basically link tax records with the population census and the survey. And you're all familiar with all the work that Piketty has been doing using tax records to argue that inequality is actually much higher than we often believe on the basis of our surveys. I think that small area estimation can contribute to this debate by showing that actually the truth is in between the survey and the tax records, because the reality is that if the tax records, it is true that the tax records do a great job capturing income at the top end of the distribution. But in Latvia, for instance, we've seen that the survey does a much better job capturing the income at the bottom of the distribution. And talking to colleagues of the US Census Bureau, they said that they got the same results for the US. And in reality, basically, the inequality, it's not as low as the survey, but it's not as high as in the tax record. It's actually somewhere in between. And in Latvia, we were able to see basically how much of, only 39% of the survey income was reflected in the tax records, 70%, and of course, 114. So the only actually group on the Latvia income distribution in which the tax records were actually higher than the small area estimated value for that population was on the top decile of income distribution. For everybody else, the small area estimation gave us a higher value than the tax, right? And of course, as a consequence of that, the inequality picture is very different. I think that there's also a lot to be done on the use of small area estimation on short consumption modules or short surveys for welfare. This is another work that we've also been doing in the context of the EU, in which basically we are developing these short consumption modules, which once the data is collected, one needs to basically simulate the welfare. And the right way of doing that is using small area estimation techniques. This is an exercise that we've done for Greece, and this is just a simulation, and it shows how good of a job we do it by using small area estimation, even by certain subgroups of the population, such as children, the elderly, and the Gini. Now, of course, a lot of this is in the details, and some of the differences that are on when you're actually using ELL with heterostaticity, right? Allowing for heterostaticity. That seems to do a lot of the trick. And of course, this is a whole new area of application of SAE that I think, you know, our students need to be familiar with. And we've applied this for Croatia on a recent survey that we just conducted in March, February, in which basically we wanted to see the quality of and the access of selected public services, but we wanted to go beyond the average, and we wanted to see how heterogeneous was that quality and access of access to public services across deciles of the welfare distribution. And because we didn't have the time or the resources to do a full-fledged consumption or income survey, we use SAE to actually simulate those. And that also assures comparability of our distribution of welfare with that of the official sources of the country, such as the SILC or the household budget survey. Another area in which we've been working in the context of the EU, and this is going more into the end of the workshop, is on spatial deflation, right? I mean, I think that the elephant in the room when we're actually doing anything related to the spatial distributions of poverty is the fact that basically cost of living is not uniform across different parts of the country. So in the context of Romania, Bulgaria, and a little bit in Croatia, we've been exploring how we can use small area estimation to create, and other techniques to create measures of subnational measures of spatial deflation, right? And here we have the results of using two alternative approaches. In the first one, we are basically creating a food price index by simply smoothing the data from the household budget survey using a spatial matrix, right? So there's no modeling, there's very little. The only structure that we're imposing is the spatial structure using some spatial weight matrix, and we get the picture on the left. And on the right, what we are doing is a work with rent values. So we take the reported rent from the survey of income and living conditions, and we create a cost of living measure on the basis of the ratio of the rent, reported rent in a particular part of the country vis-a-vis the average cost of rent in the country. And for that one, we are using small area estimation. So we do use SAE because basically we are generalizing the rent data to the whole country using SAE. And what is interesting is that in spite of being very different approaches, right, the spatial pattern of the differences in cost of living in the context of Romania were very aligned. And I think there's more to be done in this area, and I would encourage you to work on that. I think that there is, work to be done on the repurpose and the reuse of small area estimations. I think that we need to, in order to make this truly useful for policymakers, right, we need to accept the fact that policymakers will take our small area estimation results and will run models with it, right? And that is something that, you know, gets the hocus pocus to most statisticians or econometricians that know how these things are done and understand that you're actually using, you know, a simulated value that has a measurement error, and all of a sudden you're using as primary data. But I think it is important to make available tools and methods that enable users to do that by taking into consideration the inference information that we have or the precision that we have from the poverty maps, right? And I think that will make the policy use of this type of data significantly stronger. Now, of course, given the topic of this conference, I have to say something about big data and remote sensing. I think that there's a lot of promising and there's a lot of excitement, but there's always the question, is this, you know, a map of the poor or a poor map? And it's not because, you know, and there's significant progress that has been made on MI and machine learning, and ML and AI on image recognition. You're probably all familiar with the net image competition. Right now, computers are doing better than humans on recognizing images. I wonder what the 5% of humans that cannot understand those images are having for breakfast, but still, computers are doing better. But it is important to, and you always get a number, right? The beauty of these things and the scary part of this as well is that you run your AI or your machine learning algorithm, and there will be a number. Now, the reality is that we need to be a lot more, I think, diligent to understand what is the quality of this number. And even if by just following very simply this literature, you know that these models are not recognizing all images in the same way, right? There are certain images, cats and dogs seem to be doing a much better, you know, than, you know, wine openers or bags and rings. So we need to keep that in mind, because it's not because you can do it that we should do it, and even less that we maybe should use it for policy. And so definitely I don't think we are at prime time yet, right? I don't think any of us would go into a plane that we knew that had a probability of arriving at the destination at 40%, right? and that's what basically, you know, this is the validation of the paper that came out in Science, you know, on using machine learning and convoluted network to show how great a job it can be done, or the potential that it can be done for poverty measure, right? And yes, you know, for assets in Rwanda, it has a cross-validation of 0.75. I'm not so sure if I would get in the plane that I knew that I had a 75% probability of arriving at the destination. And I don't know if maybe we should recommend the use of that for policy, especially for countries that are severely constrained in terms of resources and budget, right? Now, it is coming, and will get better. I have, I think, full confidence that will. And this is just one type of big data, which is the remote sensing, which when it comes from economic development, which is where I come from, it's one of the only two games in town, right? We either use mobile CDR, call detailed records, or we use remote sensing, right? Now, in the context of the EU, you have a lot more richer data sets, such as tax records and other sources of big data that one can use and should explore. But let's also always take all of this with a grain of salt, because I think there's still much progress to be done. And this is another example, because there's a lot of these things that we observe from space, and this is the relationship of nightlight in Tajikistan, when we actually were able to use IoT devices to ground true the spatial patterns of power outages in the country, right? And what we found is that basically at the national level, right, the correlation between patterns of power outage and nightlight data, right, are extremely high, right? 0.92, 0.85, you can argue. But when you start breaking this down seasonally and spatially, you start finding a lot of variation. And for small area estimation, what we want is precisely this spatial temporal variation. And I think there's much to be done, I think, on our ability to bring those spatial temporal dimensions, especially as part of the approaches on official statistics. So another area in which we've been working is creating tools to facilitate the replicability and the implementation of this kind of work. Some of you might have heard of POVMAP, which is POVMAP 2, which is a code that the bank has developed in its C for the production of small area estimation using the ELL approach and the empirical bias, the empirical BAST. We have recently developed a package in Stata, which we're making available to anyone to use it. It's not the default package for statisticians, but it is something that economists use a lot. And now computationally we are, I think, in very good terms. And the idea is to have a modular and open design. So basically anybody is invited to contribute with subroutines and modules to this package. Right? We don't think that we will corner the R market or the Python. That's not the business we're in. But I think that for the statistical agencies on certain countries, it is, I think, a useful alternative. And one last thing that it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine when it comes to Europe is data access. I think that there is much to be said in terms of how I think the EU should think of how to make data more easily available to researchers and users. And what this table shows is the number of citations of different surveys around the world. And you can see the Brazilian PNAD got about 25,000 citations. The US CPS, 127,000 citations. The DHS, almost 400,000 citations. When it comes to the SILC, the Survey of Income and Living Conditions, which has comparable statistics for 27 countries over a period of almost 20 years, right? I mean, believe me, there's no better data for social economic analysis out there than this, okay? The number of citations is 26,000. When it comes to the UDB, which is the harmonized silk, right, that you can download, 1,000. Right, this is using Google Scholar as of June 2017. I find it surprisingly low, the number of citations, and this has to do with the terms of use, right? This is something that, you know, Eurostat and May 25th is coming, so the new data protection laws are coming in, and my prior is that it's just going to get harder and harder to actually access survey data, right? Which I think it's a paradox of our times, right? At the same time that we have the data deluge, we're not going to have training data to actually make use of this data deluge, right? And that, I think it's which is the traditional survey data. And this is something that the community of statisticians in Europe, I think, need to look at it and benchmark yourselves against other parts of the world, right? Such as the US and even developing countries, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, right? Or, you know, which have much open access or terms of use of data. So I think I'm almost. So I will wrap it up now and then open for questions. So I think just to recap, I think some of the main remarks that I would like to leave you with, and I'm very much looking forward to the sessions in the next couple of days. So you know, I'm sure I'll learn a lot during the next days. Is that I think that it is important to do a very good job explaining to our policymakers that the level of our spatial analysis matters for our understanding of the social problems as well as the effectiveness of our policies, right? I mean, the reality that, you know, we showed how different one can have an understanding on public expanding in the EU, depending if you're using data the NUTS 3 or the LAO, right? I think it's something that it is important for policymakers at both the national but also at the regional level to understand. I think that the EU member states and the statistical agencies in the region are extremely well positioned on this agenda of linking population census with surveys. And it's surprising to me why small area estimation is not something that you find, you know, departments other than in Poland, for instance, at least among the new member states that we engage with, we really didn't find a very strong capacity in the statistical agencies on using, and even in Poland, which is a country that has a whole unit on small area estimation, the statistical agency doesn't use and doesn't recognize the poverty estimates using SAE as official statistic, and they were extremely reluctant to use it. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on basically increasing the comfort level of official statisticians in the region regarding these methods. I think that there's a lot to be done also in terms of the presentation, documentation, and the reuse of these estimates. I mean, I think that there's a lot of work that has been done that, to be honest, it is very hard to replicate the results. It's very hard to identify what model was used, what kind of specifications were done, what kind of assurance there is that there was no overfitting, so on and so forth. So, and let's not, you know, although we should all be optimistic regarding the big data agenda, let's also not forget that there are problems and there are challenges with it still. And it's really not ready for prime time. And my prior is that a lot of this is it's going to be about the 2020 round of the population census that will enable us for the first time to validate a lot of this and really kind of set the grounds to make this sort of data, sources of data, official statistics. Thank you.
So many thanks, Pedro, for your very important keynote speech. Important for us, but in general, I would say, but for us because you are touched every you are touching every possible topics to develop in the following tables and sessions. So I have many comments, but are they quick reactions or comments from the audience, from the floor? If not, just to break the ice, I would say that, okay, I understand that this small area estimation is not very popular in official statistics, but I must say also that in Italy, this is not so true. I mean, it is true that in the university curricula, we do not find small area estimation as a principal topic, but this is not true in PISA, because thanks to the Master of Science of Economics, we have a course devoted to these topics, and we think that teaching is one of the first tools to apply in order to have new generations of experts in it, and to bridge the gap between policymakers and researchers. So this is my comment, and I think that what you have shown is what we need to understand. So data integration is the future, and if we want to integrate data, we need also to take into consideration the problem of comparisons in time and space. So we have a sort of guideline, general rules to share between countries, and to make sure that these are new data, this is small area estimates. They can be used, but they can be used because they can be compared. So it is a model-based estimation stuff, and so it is very important, the procedure of validating the estimate, internal and external validation, and we will discuss it. And also, one of the problems is how to summarize and synthesize the different dimensions of poverty. You have shown that there are different classifications of cities, of metropolitan areas, taking into consideration different indexes, poverty, monetary poverty measures, and other indexes. So there is a lot to do. It is true, and we thank you a lot for having done this beautiful scenario. If you have some other comments, we can have just few minutes before the coffee break, and then we go on with the discussion. So please, don't be shy. Come here. Come here. Yeah, please. Introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Marcin Szymkowiak from Poland. I work at statistical office in Poland. At the end of your presentation, you mentioned about Poland, that we still do not treat your results as official statistics, and you are absolutely right. And I had two questions. The first question is, how is it in the case of other countries? Do they use your poverty maps and treat them as official statistics? And the second question is to the slide number 3 of 4. I saw the map of NUTS-free regions in European Union, and as far as I know, the World Bank is trying to use different methods in area of small area estimation and prepare poverty maps for different European countries using model-based approach, but different techniques. And is it possible to compare your results across countries and across NUTS-free regions? Because there is one map, and I was trying to hear your opinion about this fact. Thank you.
Maybe there is some other. Daniela, please come. So.
I'm Daniela Cocchi of the University of Bologna, and I was really impressed and fascinated by the topic touched by the speaker, and I only should like to attract your attention of another kind of poverty, that is the poverty coming from the exploiting land. And indeed, I noticed that you mentioned something that can be linked to land use, to urban sprawl, and you also mentioned the local indicators of spatial association that are wonderful. And I should like to stress that they need, for being useful, to enjoy the property of additivity, because you have to sum up. And the idea, in my opinion, the local indicators of spatial association are winners when they consider binary variables. One that is poverty against everything else. But if, and not but, if you have many classes and you tend to have an infinity of classes, so you enter in the way of how studying entropy and how to use entropy in machine learning things, I think that a world can open on this.
So I think that we have time just for one other. Please, Matteo, come.
Thank you very much. Matteo Mazziotta from Italian National Institute of Statistics. This is a very simple question. Are we ready to use small area estimation in official statistics? So, what is the distance in terms of time, for example, to apply poverty estimation in municipalities or a small part of the Rome, for example, big city? Thank you.
So please, you are free to give your replies of your impressions, but consider that we have all the afternoon if you want, okay?
And I'll be in for the next couple of days, so please, looking very much to learn more from you and discuss many of these and other issues related to this topic. Thank you very much for your comments and questions. I think that I fully agree with you, Monica, that teaching is a critical aspect of this. I think it is also important to, in the context of EU member states, to really engage with Eurostat, because Eurostat has a massive signaling.
Excuse me, we have Eurostat here. Dario Buono is on the chair.
Okay. See, I have not looked at who is present, so maybe I should have. Right? So I'm making all these comments. I'm very relieved. But anyway, but I think it's very important to really have a discussion about standards and procedures for internal and external validation, and where do we set the bars for this? And really, and I think Eurostat is moving in that direction, right? I think that the fact that, and I think to answer a bit the question of the colleague from the Italian Statistical Agency, I think that the European answer to that is yes. It's now part of, it's considered experimental statistics, and experimental statistics is part of the national system of statistics. So as such, I think we're good to go. Now, you also mentioned, should we do a poverty map for Rome, right? Well, that I think we should be very careful, right? Again, it's the same as, not because you have the data and you can, then maybe you should. Right, because your survey is not going to be representative, and you don't know if you're going to have to write common support to actually capture the heterogeneity of Rome with proper accuracy. Now, I've seen poverty maps done for cities. It always, scares me, to be honest, right? Because especially, in countries where we know that the surveys are very, very small, right? And we're not designed to be, to have any kind of data, or we know that doesn't capture necessarily the heterogeneity of the population in some of these countries. This is not the context of the EU. I'm thinking of Ghana and Mozambique more than, but I think it is something to always think about the internal and external validation protocols for this. But I think, we should use it more. And I think it is interesting to see, at least that is my impression. I don't know if others would agree, but my sense is that smart estimation is used in two very different ways, right? I think that there is, in Canada, for instance, my impression at least is that a lot of times it is used to improve precision on the level of reported statistics in which the survey was already designed to be representative of, right? While in the U.S., a lot of times it's really being used more to kind of report at a more granular, lower level. Now, I don't think, I think that this is a fit to purpose, and maybe there is, I think there, both ways are valid and useful ways. I think, again, it's just being cognizant of the measurement error that you have on your estimate and being transparent about it as well, right? And then the user should know when and how to use it. I think that on Poland, yes, there are countries that are using it as official statistics. In outside the EU, there are a number of them, like Mexico, for instance, uses it as official statistics, and it uses for many of their social programs. In the context of the EU, I think the choice that has been made is that at the NUTS 3, it should be considered experimental statistics, which is part of the national system of official statistics, right? And I would love to hear more the Poland story, because my colleague Ken was the one who was working closely with Poland. So much of what I've learned it was kind of secondhand. But I think it's always curious to me why some countries are more reluctant to embrace those methods.
So many thanks. Dario, would you like to react? And then we have the coffee. Please.
So, Dario Buono from Eurostat, working in methodology and research unit. So, thank you very much for your presentation, and also for mentioning so many times Eurostat, and I was not expecting to. So, whatever I will say will be just my personal opinion and not the official position of Eurostat, just to clarify, since I know that we are web streaming and I don't want to get in trouble. Just building on what Monica said before, I mean, at Eurostat we are very much familiar with smaller estimation, and as you referred already 10 years ago, we drafted an handbook on precision requirements where we have find full of references. And of course, I see the interest in this particular technique as a cycle. So it comes and then goes and then come back. And recently, well, in the last 3 years, and there are many people in this room that can testimony, I mean, Eurostat has done an investment. We had a research line in H2020, which was open also for small estimation project. We also have started again some trainings. In particular, we had Domingo Morales coming to Eurostat for an internal training course, and this will also be organized for the statistical offices, and I'm happy to share more information about that. And of course, the idea, the issue why for some time we were not interested anymore. I mean, when you go to such a workshop, conference, events, when you started with your slides and you had this example with the 2011 data, I was like, oh my God, here again we go with it. Because the issue is the timeliness. The value of what you're presenting using data from 6 years from now is difficult to sell to the buyer, right? But then you really opened my mind, and then you went to say, these are model-based estimates, there are plenty of applications, and the idea that these methods can help also to save some money because we don't have to do the survey anymore, and at some point people will simply not answering anymore to the survey, so we have to use some model-based method. And in particular, there is now a new interest, or in particular to go even lower in details, not only from NUT 3 to the municipal level, but to the city level, for city and urban statistics, and we can discuss maybe in the next book about this. And the very last thing, this is an idea that I launched today, maybe at the end of the 3 days we can see. The issue with model area estimation is also the name. In an area where we always talk about big data, if you talk about something small, then it does not really work. So my proposal and would simply be without changing the acronyms, instead of calling small area estimation and building on what you suggest, can we call it spatial area estimation?
We have 3 days to discuss about this. I think that now, thanking everybody, it's time to have a coffee. What do you think?